Picture this: a family in Ohio, 2009. They built a plumbing business over 22 years, 3 trucks, 6 employees, a house paid down to its last 8 years of mortgage, a retirement account that 18 months ago looked like dignity in numerical form. Then the crash arrived. The contracts dried up first, then the credit line, then the 401k statement came in the mail, and the number on it looked like a typo. The bank called about the mortgage in February. By April, the business was gone. By June, so was the house. That house, the one with 22 years of weekends and overtime and school fundraisers and birthday parties inside it, sold at a foreclosure auction for 63 cents on the dollar. The buyer was not a neighbor. It was not a young family finally catching a break in an expensive market. It was a private equity fund, registered in Delaware, managing capital on behalf of institutional investors whose names you would recognize. They paid 63 cents for an asset worth $1. They rented it back to families like the one that just lost it. They packaged it with 10,000 identical acquisitions into a financial instrument. They sold that instrument to pension funds, and they called it a recovery. This is not a story about one family in Ohio. This is the operating model of the modern financial system during every economic contraction in the last century. And the people running that model are not waiting for the next crash to begin executing it. They started 18 months ago. The pivot earn on financial television during any market downturn, and the message is consistent, professional, and wrong in exactly the right way. Stay the course. Time in the market beats timing the market. Don't panic, sell, rebalance, and hold. This advice is not fabricated. It is not a conspiracy of deliberate misinformation. For a retail investor with a 40-year time horizon and a diversified index portfolio, it is reasonable guidance. But it is advice engineered for one type of participant, and it is being delivered to a different type of participant entirely. The institutional investor, the sovereign wealth fund, the endowment, the family office managing inherited capital across generations, does not receive this advice. They are the ones giving it, through the financial media they own, the advisory relationships they fund, and the cultural conditioning that makes staying the course feel like wisdom instead of what it actually is during a severe contraction. A holding pattern, a burning building where the alarm sounds like a lullaby. While the middle class is told to hold, the people who understand the mechanics of what is happening are executing a playbook that has been running, with minor variations, across every major economic dislocation in modern history. 3 specific assets, 3 specific mechanisms. Each one designed not merely to preserve wealth through a crash, but to use the crash as the acquisition event it has always been. Here is what that playbook actually contains. Shadow Asset 1. Ammunition, short-term sovereign debt. In the summer of 2023, Berkshire Hathaway's quarterly SEC filing revealed something that the financial press could not stop talking about for the wrong reasons. Warren Buffett was sitting on more than $130 billion in short-term treasury bills and cash equivalents. The commentary was immediate and almost universally dismissive. He was too conservative. He was missing the rally. The greatest investor of the 20th century had finally lost his edge, hoarding cash while the market climbed. This analysis missed the point so completely it almost requires deliberate effort to explain. Buffett was not saving. He was loading a weapon. The distinction is not semantic. It is structural. And understanding it is the difference between understanding how institutional wealth operates and spending your financial life reading headlines written for people who aren't supposed to understand. Here is the iron mechanics of why cash, specifically short-duration sovereign debt, becomes the most powerful asset in existence in the 18 to 24 months before a major market dislocation. Every crash requires sellers. This is not a financial insight. It is arithmetic. When asset prices fall, they fall because more people are selling than buying. The forced selling of leveraged investors, people who borrowed to buy assets and must now liquidate to meet margin calls, creates a cascade. Each forced sale drives prices lower. Lower prices trigger more margin calls. More margin calls create more forced sellers. The cascade stops when it runs out of sellers or finds buyers with sufficient capital to absorb the supply. The entity with cash is the only buyer in a market full of desperate sellers. And a desperate seller does not negotiate from strength. Look at the documented mechanics of 2008. At the trough of the financial crisis, S&P 500 companies had lost approximately 57% of their market value. Businesses that had been generating reliable cash flows for decades were available at prices that implied the end of capitalism, rather than a severe but temporary economic contraction. Buffett deployed capital at that trough with a precision and scale that is documented in Berkshire's public filings. The Goldman Sachs transaction, $5 billion at terms so favorable they were only available because Goldman was desperate, generated over $3 billion in profit. The Burlington Northern Santa Fe acquisition in late 2009 purchased a railroad, a piece of actual physical American infrastructure generating predictable cash flows at prices that the pre-crisis market would never have offered. He could execute these transactions because he was the buyer. Almost everyone else was a seller. The Knight Frank Wealth Report from 2009 documented what it called a sharp elevation in liquidity preference among ultra-high net worth individuals beginning as early as 2006. Not 2008, 2006. 2 years before the crisis became visible to mainstream financial media, the people with the most sophisticated understanding of market dynamics were accumulating the one asset that would give them maximum flexibility when the dislocation arrived. Short-duration treasury bills specifically. Not long bonds, not equities, not gold. Instruments maturing in 90 to 180 days, rolling continuously, maintaining full liquidity, earning a modest yield while preserving the capacity to convert immediately into any other asset the moment the opportunity appeared. This is not available only to billionaires. A standard brokerage account provides access to treasury bills through Treasury Direct or through money market funds holding equivalent instruments. The vehicle is accessible. The discipline required to hold it while markets are rising, and the cultural pressure to stay invested is intense. That is what is scarce. The SEC 13F filings of major institutional investors in 2006 and 2007 tell the same story across multiple portfolios. Cash and short-duration sovereign debt positions increasing, equity exposure reducing, not dramatically, not in ways that would signal distress or trigger copycat behavior, methodically, quietly. With the patience of entities that have watched this cycle operate before and know what the elevated cash position is for, they were loading the weapon. They knew when they would need to fire it. Shadow asset. 2. The monopoly. Graveyard. Distressed debt and essential services. Howard Marks sat down in October of 2008. Markets in freefall, Lehman gone, the financial system in genuine existential crisis, and wrote a memo to Oaktree Capital's clients that is now studied in graduate finance programs. His core thesis was this: distressed debt is not a bet on survival. It is a legal mechanism for acquiring ownership of real assets at a fraction of their replacement cost, bypassing the equity market entirely. Most people have never heard this explained clearly. The financial press covers bankruptcy as a story of failure. Companies gone, jobs lost, shareholders wiped out. The narrative ends there. The part that comes next, the part that matters enormously for understanding how wealth actually transfers during economic crises, is the part that rarely gets told. Here is the mechanism with the opacity removed. A company, a regional plumbing supply chain, a commercial real estate operator, a retail network, enters financial distress. Its publicly traded bonds crater. A bond issued at 100 cents on the dollar may trade at 15 cents, 20 cents, sometimes less. The market, illiquid and panicked, prices these instruments for total loss. Retail investors flee. Financial media writes obituaries. At this moment, the sophisticated money arrives. Not to speculate on recovery, to acquire ownership. When a company enters bankruptcy, its assets, its physical infrastructure, its client relationships, its contracts, its real estate, do not disappear. They exist. They have replacement value that often bears no relationship to the distressed price of the company's debt. The bankruptcy court's job is to restructure the company's obligations and distribute its assets according to a legally established priority waterfall. Senior secured debt at the top, junior debt below, equity at the bottom, typically receiving nothing. A distressed debt fund that purchases junior bonds at 15 cents on the dollar is not buying a hope of coupon payments. It is buying a position in the creditor waterfall. When the bankruptcy court reorganizes the company, old equity is wiped out entirely. The bondholders receive new equity shares in the reorganized entity in proportion to their position. The distressed debt buyer entered as a creditor. They emerge as the owner. They paid 15 cents for assets that the pre-distress market valued at $1. The 2008 crisis generated this mechanism at industrial scale. General Growth Properties, at the time the second largest mall operator in the United States, managing over 200 shopping centers, filed for bankruptcy in April 2009. Its debt traded at levels implying near total loss. Brookfield Asset Management built significant positions in that distressed paper. When GGP emerged from bankruptcy in November 2010, Brookfield held a controlling equity stake in a company managing billions of dollars in commercial real estate. Entry price, distressed bonds acquired for pennies. Exit position, controlling ownership of 200 shopping malls. The original equity holders, the retail investors and fund shareholders who had owned GGP stock, received nothing. The distressed debt buyers became the new owners. The bankruptcy court's legal machinery executed the transfer with perfect procedural legitimacy. This is not a malfunction of the system. It is the system operating as designed. The second half of this shadow asset is the one that compounds the advantage across decades rather than just across a single cycle. Essential service businesses, waste management, pest control, self-storage, funeral services, water infrastructure, medical waste processing, share a property that sounds unremarkable until you say it plainly. People cannot stop using these services regardless of economic conditions. A family that has lost its income still generates garbage. It still needs storage when it downsizes. It still requires pest control when the infestation does not consult unemployment statistics before arriving. Death operates entirely independent of monetary policy. The economic profile of these businesses during a downturn is almost perverse in its advantage to the acquirer. Their revenues remain stable while their labor costs fall as unemployment eliminates workers' negotiating leverage. Their competitors, smaller operators using debt to finance expansion, default and go under. The acquiring entity purchases routes, contracts, client relationships, and physical equipment at liquidation prices from operators who can no longer service their obligations. Wayne Huizenga understood this before almost anyone in modern private equity. He built waste management into a national giant not during an economic boom, but by acquiring small regional operators during the stagflationary recession of the mid-1970s. No innovation required, no disruption thesis, no technology edge. Garbage trucks drive the same route whether the economy is growing at 4% or contracting at 4%. He acquired the assets when sellers were distressed. He held the monopoly when the economy recovered. He repeated the cycle in subsequent contractions. PitchBook data on private market transactions documents the pattern repeating in every cycle. Between 2009 and 2012, acquisition of essential service businesses by institutional private equity accelerated by over 40% compared to pre-crisis levels. The underlying cash flows of these businesses, the actual economic substance that makes them valuable, remained entirely intact while their acquisition prices reflected the distress of their former owners. The transfer mechanism ran exactly as it always does, from the unprepared to the prepared, from the leveraged to the liquid, from the operator who built the business to the institution that understood what the business was worth at the bottom of a cycle. Shadow Asset 3, the caloric floor, productive farmland. In 2023, a report by the Land Report confirmed what had been circulating in agricultural industry data for several years. Bill Gates had accumulated approximately 270,000 acres of American farmland across at least 18 states. The largest private farmland owner in the United States is not a farmer. He is not an agricultural conglomerate. He is the co-founder of a technology company, one of the wealthiest individuals in human history, whose investment thesis on agricultural land has nothing to do with growing crops and everything to do with the single property that makes farmland unlike any other asset class in existence: caloric necessity. The floor beneath farmland's value is not built on monetary policy or credit conditions or investor sentiment. It is built on the biological requirement of human beings to consume calories to sustain life. This floor has never been breached in recorded history, and it cannot be breached by any instrument of monetary policy ever invented. A central bank can print currency. It can devalue sovereign debt through inflation. It can suppress interest rates until savers are effectively paying for the privilege of holding their money in institutions. It can do none of these things to an acre of productive soil in Iowa. The Knight Frank Farmland Index documents the performance of prime agricultural land against every major financial dislocation of the last 20 years. During the dot-com collapse, American farmland values were essentially flat. During the 2008 financial crisis, when the S&P 500 lost 57% of its value, prime farmland declined less than 5% and recovered within 18 months. During the 2020 COVID shock, when commercial real estate entered a multi-year reckoning and REITs lost 40% of their value in weeks, farmland gained 7%. This performance is not luck, it is structural. When paper assets deflate, when the monetary system that assigns value to stocks and bonds and currencies comes under sufficient stress, capital seeks assets whose value is anchored to something that cannot be printed, cannot be manipulated by central bank balance sheet expansion, and cannot be made irrelevant by sovereign default. Food is that anchor. But the caloric floor is only the defensive dimension of agricultural land's value proposition. The offensive dimension, the one that explains why sophisticated capital has been accumulating farmland at a pace with no modern precedent, is the control dimension. In every monetary system collapse in modern history, the assets that not only preserved value but generated power were the assets that controlled access to physical necessities. Post-World War I, Germany provides the forensic documentation. As the mark hyperinflated into worthlessness in 1923, the families and institutions holding agricultural land, denominated in real productive capacity rather than in paper currency, maintained purchasing power. They did not merely preserve wealth, they expanded it, acquiring neighboring properties from families who could no longer pay mortgages that had been issued in marks but whose real burden had not inflated away. The same dynamic played out in Venezuela after 2015. Farmland connected to export agriculture, producing commodities with dollar-denominated international buyers, maintained real value as the Bolivar collapsed. Urban commercial real estate denominated in the local currency became worthless. One asset was anchored to global demand. The other was anchored to a monetary system that ceased to function. When paper money burns, whoever owns the food supply owns the future. This is not a conspiratorial framing. It is the oldest observation in the history of political economy. Land that feeds people has always, in every civilization across every century of recorded history, been the foundation of durable wealth and durable power. The billionaires accumulating agricultural land are not eccentric hobbyists. They are reading a ledger that is older than any stock market, and they are positioning accordingly. 3 assets, 3 mechanisms, one consistent principle running through all of them. Economic crashes are not random natural disasters. They are predictable, cyclical redistribution events. Capital flows from the unprepared to the prepared, from the panicked to the patient, from the passive holder to the structurally positioned acquirer. The family in Ohio, who lost their plumbing business and their house in 2009, was not a victim of bad luck. They were the output of a system that had been designed, over decades of legal and financial architecture, to transfer productive assets from dispersed middle-class ownership to concentrated institutional ownership during precisely the moments when the middle class was least equipped to resist the transfer. The media told them to stay the course. The private equity fund was at the auction. You do not need $1 billion to understand this mechanism. You do not need access to a prime brokerage account or a relationship with a distressed debt fund. What you need is the willingness to look at what people building generational wealth are actually doing. Not what they say at Davos, not what they publish in op-eds about their commitment to stakeholder capitalism, what they are filing with the SEC, what they are acquiring through bankruptcy courts, what they are buying in Iowa and Kansas and the Central Valley of California, while the financial media is covering the latest earnings miss on a technology stock. The next crash is already casting its shadow forward. The T-bill accumulations are visible in public filings. The private farmland acquisitions are documented in county records. The distressed debt positions are building in the portfolios of funds whose quarterly letters are read by the people who manage the capital of sovereign nations. The transfer mechanism is running. The only question is which side of it you want to be standing on when the event arrives. Subscribe to Economic Chronicles. Stay awake in a sleeping world.